Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of CAUSA International and CAUSA USA, may I sincerely welcome all of you to this conference. I thank you for your deep interest in the CAUSA movement. CAUSA is a new educational movement working on a global scale. We strongly oppose communism, and yet we do not consider ourselves to be merely anti-communist, simply because anti-communism is not enough. Anti is a defensive and passive expression. In any battle or war, you will never win victory with defense alone. We have been preaching anti-communism for 67 years since the Bolshevik Revolution, and we are steadily losing ground. As long as we are anti-communist, the best we can do is postpone the defeat. We'll never have a chance to win. What we need is a positive solution to communism or a winning strategy. What we need is an ideological offensive. Our war against communism is primarily a war of ideas, a war of commitment. The battlefield of this war is the mind of men. In the next several days, we are going to discuss these very things. What are the problems facing us today? How can we work toward the real solutions of these problems and avoid becoming victims of communism? How can we liberate the millions of people who have already been victimized through deception or force by the communists? CAUSA is more than anti-communist. Nothing short of the liberation of communism is CAUSA's goal. As I said, CAUSA is a global movement. Yet today, we are putting our entire effort into the United States of America. Why? Because it is this nation, the United States of America, which holds the key to the future of the world. The United States is a young nation, and yet she is a great nation. But how has she achieved greatness? This greatness is not the result of her natural resources or her geographical location. America has achieved greatness because of her faith in God and compassion toward the world. Alexis de Tocqueville, the perceptive French political scientist and historian who visited America in the early 19th century, saw this very clearly. He said, America is great because America is good. And when America ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. In what way has America been good? She is good because she has been a good Samaritan. The recent rescue of the tiny island of Grenada from the hands of Soviet-backed Marxist Leninists is an example of the United States being a good Samaritan. The Washington Times proclaimed that accomplishment with an editorial entitled Grenada Libre. Is it wrong to be looking forward to Cuba Libre, Nicaraguan Libre, and ultimately Soviet Union Libre? Many people in the United States would say that that is nonsense. But when we think for a moment about God, the Creator, with purpose, would he not think the same thing as we do? If God truly exists, the freedom must be his goal. In recent years, however, we have seen this nation of America steadily losing faith in God and concern for the fellow man. The Good Samaritan, the United States of America, is now fast becoming the Levite who passes the wounded man in the Bible. The Bible said the Levite passed on to the other side. But the irony is this. Today, the United States cannot pass to the other side of suffering neighbors in order to avoid the thieves. Why? The thieves are after the United States. There is no way that the United States can flourish while the rest of the world perishes. The free world has one common destiny. In order to have the United States survive, The free world must survive. If the world goes, the United States goes. If the United States goes, of course, the world goes. So we must live by one truth. United we stand, divided we fall. In order to have our free world stand, the United States of America must be a good Samaritan again. Now is the time to renew the spirit of great American patriots and the founding spirit of the nation. We have many good forefathers as examples: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln in the United States, and Simon Bolivar, the San Martin, and Morazan, Hidalgo, Jose Marti, and others in Latin America. They worked tirelessly and sacrificially for freedom and democracy under God. Why were these people great? Because they were inspired by an idea or ideals and are dedicated to those ideals. So today, we can do the same. We can be as great as they are. After all, we live in the age of sainthood. All we have to do is to be inspired by an idea or a great ideal. That is what CAUSA is trying to accomplish. Human freedom and democracy under God is precisely the goal of CAUSA. CAUSA promotes not only opposition to communism, but liberation from and of communism. This liberation movement is gaining momentum, and Grenada is just the beginning. We want to continue to pursue the goal of freedom. This does not mean that the solutions always be military, but it means that positive action and total commitment is absolutely necessary to stop the international lawlessness of communism. Let me now explain more about the history of CAUSA. The CAUSA movement began in Latin America through the inspiration and vision of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. He initiated this movement in response to an acute and immediate need, the need to provide an ideological framework for Latin America in its struggle against communism. CAUSA, C-A-U-S-A, originally were the initials of a very long name, Confederation of Association for the Unity of the Societies of the Americas. At the recent seminar in the Dominican Republic, CAUSA was given a new name by one inspired lady. She said the CAUSA stood for Con Amor y Unión Salvaremos of America. This means, as many of you know, with love and unity, we will save America. Yet CAUSA outgrew the Americas a long time ago. This movement is needed everywhere: Europe, Africa, and Asia, and so forth. As our work expanded beyond the Americas, we found that our old name was not international enough. So now we no longer keep the long name, but we are still CAUSA, the Latin word for cause. CAUSA symbolizes the common cause and aspiration of all free men. CAUSA is a God-centered humanitarian movement working against the worst inhumanity in history, international communism. Beyond this, CAUSA strives toward the ultimate realization of the human dream of the ideal society. In contrast to communism, CAUSA upholds God as the source of men's freedom and creativity. What is the single worst problem which humanity faces today? In a recent issue of Commentary magazine, French author Jean-François Revel made this observation. I quote, "The closer we get to the end of the century, the more communist imperialism becomes the chief problem of our time. No other threat to the world's freedom has endured as long. A system that has grown so strong despite so many failings must embody a principle of action and a concentration of power more effective than any mankind has ever known before. communism and the Soviet Empire are unprecedented in history, end quote. It is startling to compare communism with Christianity. Christ came 2,000 years ago and gave the world a powerful message of truth and love. Christianity has now become the world's largest religion and has been received by nearly 1/4 of the world population. But it took 2,000 years. Communism, on the other hand, was only born in the last century, and yet it has become to enslave more people than are now Christians. During a short span of little more than a half a century, Marxism, Leninism has spread like a forest fire. In this time, it has engulfed more than 1.5 billion people, taking one nation after another and spreading over the entire globe. Communist strategists are proudly declaring that by the year 2000, the entire world will live under the communist utopia, when Nikita Khrushchev threatened the West by saying, "We shall bury you." It might have seemed like an idle boast. Today, when we study geopolitical realities, it looks like the Soviets are actually ahead of schedule. By the year 2000, a showdown between communism and freedom shall inevitably be made, one way or another. The next few years shall be the most crucial time in human history, and will determine the destiny of the all of mankind. Will our children live in freedom, or will they live under a totalitarian system? No one knows. Yet, one thing is clear. The problem of communism is not something that someone else should worry about. It is my problem, and it's your problem. Our destiny and our children's well-being are at stake. To defeat communism, we must understand it. What is communism anyway? Where does its power come from? Communism is more than a political system, more than a social system, and more than an economic system. Communism is an ideology, a system of thought. Even though we know that communism is based on lies and deception, its false promises have the power to conquer a man's mind so completely that he would give his life for the victory of communism. That is the power of communism. It stems out of the power of faith, power of ideology. That power defeated the United States in the Vietnam War. The outcome of the Vietnam was not a military defeat. It was an ideological defeat. The communists assaulted America ideologically until she became confused and demoralized and unable to carry on the fight. The United States of America abandoned the $5 billion in weapons in South Vietnam. When there's no clear purpose and a will to fight, $5 billion worth of military armaments will not do any good. In order to combat communism, we must fight with the same weapon which they use, ideology. A false ideology must be subjugated by a superior one. We must fight fire with fire. There is no other way we can fight and win. Mr. David Sadler, special correspondent of the Wall Street Journal and the former Moscow correspondent of the Financial Times, wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal on May 23, 1983, entitled, "Soviet Threat is One of Ideas More Than Arms." I quote from the article. As absurd as communist ideology may appear, it provides us a consistent view of history to adherents and makes even the simplest citizen feel as though his life has meaning. Communism cannot be defeated militarily, and its adherents cannot be bribed into giving it up. It can be defeated in only one way, by being confronted with an idea that is better, end quote. What is then that better idea? People say, well, today we have a democracy. But democracy is not an ideology. It is not a system of thought. Democracy is the system of government. Some people say, well, we have freedom. Yet freedom is not an ideology either. It is a goal of ideology. Freedom is a fruit we enjoy when true democracy is practiced. Ironically, even Karl Marx claimed that his ultimate goal was the realization of freedom. Then what do we have to combat aggressive communism? Certainly we have Christianity and other religions of the world. These religions are the God-accepting forces which oppose the God-denying forces of communism. But it is a painful reality that today's religions have demonstrated a lack of effectiveness in countering the spread of communism. One Christian nation after another has fallen into the hands of communism. Today, clearly, the religious world is in crisis. Religion seems to be unable to control the confusion of the world and elevate the human spirit. We can cite several causes for the collapse of the religious perspective, including the subtle intrusion of materialistic thought into all levels of society, as well as the subversion of the religious world by the forces of communism. But the greatest factor which is undermining the religious world today is the lack of a clear understanding of the reality of God. The essential fact in our religious world today is that we are not sure about God. This is an honest statement. God has been progressively excluded from the life of modern-day men. Today, people are confused about the very purpose of God's creation, and thus man does not know what purpose he should live for. Out of this confusion, the God is dead philosophy emerged, and the liberation theology was made very popular in all of Latin America. Man is trying to take God's place because he feels that God is either dead or helpless. Today, the struggle between communism and the free world is really a struggle of ideas. It is boiling down to the question of theism or atheism, or better yet, God or no God. If God does not exist, then communism may very well be correct. Once God is removed, communism does indeed offer a very convincing explanation of human life. However, if God truly exists, then there is no question that communism is false. Communism is based on very denial of God. Since two contradictory beliefs cannot both be true, then there must be showdown. Who shall win? Communism? The free world? No. Truth shall win. God or no God, one of the two must be a lie. Ultimately, lies will be defeated, and the truth shall prevail. Therefore, today in the 20th century, now more than ever, the crucial question is the question of God's existence and nature. There are people today who are asking, does God really exist? What is the purpose for creation? If God is the ultimate goodness, why does the survival of the fittest seem to prevail in our society? Why is there so much evil in our world? And why does evil seem to be winning? Unless reasonable and consistent answers are given to these questions, men of the modern age will not be willing to accept God as a reality. The CAUSA worldview is a philosophical framework that precisely deals with these very problems of the reality of God. The CAUSA worldview is a God-centered ideology which does two essential things. First, it totally exposes the lies and the deceptions of communism. And second, it presents a clear counter-proposal to the communist view. The CAUSA worldview offers a complete solution to communism. For CAUSA, this is the beginning point of the solution to world problems. We are beginning from the ground floor. From the recognition of the absolute being, we come to the awareness of the absolute value. This vantage point can be called the absolute value perspective. From the absolute value perspective, we can make the decision which will lead us to genuine progress. When a person achieves this perspective, his heart starts to change. Once man's heart changes, everything changes. Yet this change cannot be forced. Only through an awakening into the absolute value perspective can you change man's heart. It is a quiet revolution, but a fundamental and most powerful revolution. This is the revolution of men. Communism has been trying to bring about a revolution too, a very violent one, but without genuine success. Since 1917, and despite 67 years of total effort, the communist experiment has proven to be a bitter failure. According to the French magazine Le Figaro, it has cost over 150 million human lives in the name of revolution and the workers' utopia. Many people today say that paradise is lost. But I say, and I know, that nothing was lost. That paradise never came in the first place. On the contrary, the Soviet economy is dying and corruption is rampant. As a strategy for building a military empire, communism is successful. But in terms of improving the human condition, it is a miserable failure. Why is this? There are two fundamental problems with communism. One, their ideology is rigid and not scientific. It is based on lies and false assumptions. To maintain it requires the constant generation of new lies, more lies, whenever there are differences between the doctrine and the reality. Reality is denied and the doctrine is upheld. With this attitude, no progress can come. Two, communism misses the target in its diagnosis of social evil. It is not the capitalist system that is evil, as the communists believe, but rather it is a fundamental defect in men which is at fault. Communism destroys the system and sets up a new one, but the result is always the worse. Why? A new system based on false assumptions and run by people with the same corrupt nature will not work. A truly revolutionary change in society must come from the ground floor, the individual men. This is the root, and this is where the CAUSA worldview is addressing the problem. I must confess at this point, however, that it is not easy for me to speak about God when we are discussing economics and political problems. In fact, in many circles, it is not fashionable to speak about God at all. Instead, there has been a tendency toward a materialistic, humanistic interpretation of human problems and goals. Many intellectuals have come to believe that God can be excluded from consideration when dealing with the modern world problem. Obviously, CAUSA does not agree with such tendency. Dr. Kenneth Riker, a distinguished educator, a man who has been an outstanding anti-communist for many years, testified after a recent CAUSA seminar in Washington, D.C. I quote, "For the past 20 years, I have dedicated myself tirelessly to the battle against communism. I did so under the banner of freedom. Yet, in spite of my efforts, we have steadily been losing ground. Through this CAUSA seminar, I realized why freedom was not enough. To win this battle, we must rally in proclaiming the existence of God." End quote. During the next few days, you'll hear the word God frequently. We speak of God not from weakness, but from courage. When we speak of God, we do so not out of ritual, but out of clear reason based on 20th century science and logic, and with sincerity and heart. Furthermore, when we speak of God, we are speaking of the God of all religion, God of all denomination. We examine God's existence and nature philosophically. We affirm that the God of Judaism, Islam, Catholicism, Protestantism, Mormonism, Unificationism, and the God of all religions are one and the same. Our purpose, then, is not to enter into theological debate, but instead to recognize the unifying factors of all religions with our fellow man. At this point, I want to make absolutely clear that CAUSA's purpose is not to change anyone's religion. Although I'm a member of the Unification Church, I'm not here to promote unification theology. Instead, we are here to find common ground for unity. That common ground for unity is God. To know about God and more about God deeply is the only way we can unite. When we recognize one common Father clearly and unmistakably, then we all naturally become true brothers and sisters. CAUSA promotes a new way of fighting communism. We have been fighting communism in political way, social way, economic way, or military way. But none of these brought, however, to us victory yet. We must find a new way. The new way is the spiritual way. Recognizing communism as an evil religion or godless religion, you can only conquer communism by spiritual power or by proclaiming the existence of God. Light alone overcomes the darkness. God alone overcomes godlessness. In conclusion, CAUSA tried to bring together all God-accepting forces, transcendent of denomination and religion, to make one unified force. This force will be able to oppose the ungodly ideology of communism and to work toward the establishment of a new moral world. So now you see, we have come to a very interesting seminar. There are thousands of seminars going on in our world, but you may not find anything like this anywhere else. If in these 3 days you feel that you are intellectually and spiritually enriched, then we have nothing more to ask. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, I want to close my opening remarks by quoting Victor Hugo, historical utterances. More powerful than an invading army is an idea whose time has come. I do believe CAUSA is an idea whose time has come. God bless you. Thank you very much.
CAUSA is the movement that unites the family of man under God. The Confederation of Association for the Unity of the Societies of the Americas. We began our work here in the Americas. Now we reach out to the world. CAUSA believes in the harmony and unity of all people. Our goals transcend race, religion, and nationality. We are all children of God, and we must work together for the justice of all men. CAUSA is active in more than 21 countries, working to ensure the survival and prosperity of Western civilization and moral values. This is CAUSA's mission. But before CAUSA's efforts can succeed, we must take an unrelenting stand against communism. This evil ideology threatens all that is good and true in our world today. We must vanquish this perilous menace, the insidious growth of communism. Karl Marx. His teaching and ideology are responsible for the greatest misery and suffering that human history has ever seen. The ideology of Marxism brought about the first communist nation, Russia. Communism has spread like wildfire. Today, more than 1.5 billion people are hostages of the iron fist of communism. More and more nations are leaning towards socialism and communism. Communist-instigated wars are everywhere. No country today, including the United States of America, is immune to communist takeover. Indeed, revolutionary fires are burning all over the world, including the very backyard of the United States. Cuba, only 80 miles from the mainland of the U.S., became the first communist state in our hemisphere. Since then, Soviet revolutionary fires have been ignited all over Central and South America. Grenada, Nicaragua, Guyana, Suriname. Who shall be next to suffer the soul-searing destruction of the communist ideology? Panama, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, even Mexico. Following the United States withdrawal from the Vietnam War, millions of innocent victims in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were stripped of their freedom. When people are hungry or victims of natural disaster, their concerns are basic. The communists understand this well. They use human misery as the door into the hearts and minds of dispirited, frightened human beings. In only 50 years, more than 150 million people have been murdered in the name of the communist utopia. What would justify those monstrous killings? Nothing. It must be stopped now in the name of humanity. After World War II, the shocking rumors about Nazi Germany were confirmed. 6 million men, women, and children were herded like animals to their death. Yet, in a world still outraged by Hitler's barbarism, we tolerate the communist death machine. 150 million dead. We are repeating the apathy and indifference of 40 years ago, when Hitler said, "Germany wants nothing but peace." We believed him. Hitler denied the Holocaust. We believed him. Are we going to duplicate this same error? A new, godless elite has emerged. Communist strategists proclaim that by the year 2000, the entire world will live under communism. They speak of a civilization devoid of war, racism, and hunger. Many believe. When they find that they have been deceived, it is too late. Communism's power stems from its ideology. It is more than a political, social, or economic system. It conquers man's heart and soul. It gives philosophical explanations and hope. False hope. Communism demands action. More than that, its ideology engenders religious fervor. We're amazed at the ability of communism to inspire men to sacrifice not only their lives, but their immortal souls. Communism is a godless religion. Why is communism so barbaric? Communism denies God. It denies eternal life. When you deny God, you are responsible to no one. When man believes he has no spirit, he can do anything without remorse. When this delusion becomes state policy, evil rules. This is precisely the communist world. This is why CAUSA exists. CAUSA will stop communism. CAUSA will liberate those people who've already fallen into communism's dehumanizing trap, giving them true freedom. CAUSA is fighting against the communists. Our strength is God, and the God-centered worldview is our weapon. Gallup polls reveal that 95% of Americans believe in God. 84% believe in heaven. An army of believers, if only we unite. CAUSA wants to unite all God-believing people into one force and mobilize this force against the most dangerous enemy of God and man, communism. An evil ideology must be subjugated by a morally superior ideology. Fire for fire. CAUSA. An ideological offensive based on the teaching of a God-centered worldview. CAUSA goes everywhere, everywhere the need exists. Central America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia. We bring truth, hope, confidence, and conviction. Above all, we bring God. This is our power. CAUSA President Colonel Bo Pak believes in peace and prosperity for the whole world through a moral revolution. Bringing together the best thinkers to discuss this mission at educational conferences in Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, and the United States. This is just the beginning of our worldwide commitment.
The CAUSA movement is a movement of union of conscience, men of conscience. The people who united under Marxism, for example, their slogan is that the end justifies the means. They want to really take the world. They set the goal of global conquest, and of course they want to do it without God. They want to become themselves a God position. That's what the Marxists were all about. So, CAUSA is coming in as a movement to mobilize all God-accepting forces, including the forces of conscience. Why is this so vital? Because God-denying forces of communism are not standing still. They are doing everything to take the world. And I tell you, definitely before the year 2000, showdown between God or no God will be made. It is a duty of free man, duty of God-accepting people to unite together, do something about this ungodly forces of communism. This is the very thing CAUSA is trying to accomplish. And somebody has to do it. Well, the someone has to be us. But it's not just our movement. It is everybody's movement. It's a good news to the free world. But I tell you, it's CAUSA. It's a bad news to communists.
Through culture and athletic exchange programs, the people of the Americas work together and form friendship bonds. CAUSA looks to the future and helps in the development of our youngsters by involving them in leadership training programs. We reach out to helpless people, whether they need food, medical aid, shelter, or simply moral support. Our nonprofit, non-sectarian organization's purpose is to promote unity and the moral and material development of the nations of the Americas. CAUSA promotes responsible media, We support the annual World Media Conference that crusades against the double standard of the leftist media. CAUSA believes in a quiet revolution, a revolution of heart, the transition from selfishness to unselfishness. The family is the building block of the ideal society. God gave man love as the supreme gift, and the family as the school of love. The love of God makes human potential boundless and gives purpose and joy to our lives. When the presence of God is awakened in us, each individual has the potential to become a Lincoln, a Simon Bolivar, an Albert Schweitzer, or a Mother Teresa. The peoples of the Americas must nourish their belief in God, family, and peace between neighboring nations. We have been on the defensive too long. The fight against communism is a God or no God battle. The truth shall prevail. A God-sent worldview shall be victorious. Now is the time to bring about a change in man. When man changes, everything changes. When we become new men and women, everything else will become new. CAUSA must grow in our Americas first. Why? The peoples of the world look to the Americas as a source of hope, a source of encouragement, and a source of solutions. You and I are part of that solution. CAUSA. CAUSA is God-loving people. We are happy people, God-loving people. But there are unfortunate millions out there, desperate, enslaved, and without hope for tomorrow. You and I are their only hope. We cannot let them down. CAUSA cares for these people. We must bring liberation to them. Their only hope must not be betrayed. CAUSA, a movement of the highest ideals.
I like CAUSA because of the fact that CAUSA is an organization that is dedicated lock, stock, and barrel to fight communism. And you're not going to be able to fight communism without understanding communism, and CAUSA understands the nature of the beast, and they preach as such, and they are trying to educate the American public and the world, people of the world, about the dangers, the menace, and the true nature of communism. And in order to defeat communism, you have to know what communism is all about, and CAUSA is teaching that lesson. Not only are we teaching the true nature of communism so that our people will wake up to their responsibilities to combat that ungodly ideology, but it is also teaching the essence of what our forefathers, the founding fathers, taught in this country, namely love for God, love for country, and love for freedom. So I think those who attend CAUSA not only will become strong fighters against communism, but better citizens, particularly in America.
Well, I would rate CAUSA's success through a very personal view, and that is that, like many people, I think I'm too old for new causes. CAUSA is not new. It is simply a return to the basics that a lot of us believe in. I would rate its success through that prism, being able to grasp people like myself who've been all over the world and slow us down long enough to reconstruct and reaffirm our belief in the basics. I think it's important to have a God-centered worldview because, number one, it is, again, a unifying factor. It is something upon which most people can unite with no trepidation. Thirdly, I think it is one thing that we all can really look back upon as being one of the founding factors of this country, and therefore one that is difficult to argue with. You know, I truly think that the CAUSA worldview will be successful for several reasons. One, it calls upon the innate necessity we all have for self-preservation, preservation of ourselves, our families, our family life, and our country and our values. I think it'll be successful because it has such a universal appeal. And finally, I think it will be successful because it simply must be successful.
CAUSA to me presents an opportunity for young people to get reacquainted and re-educated on the importance of the democratic principles and the founding constitutional principles that our country was based on, and puts them back in touch with the belief in God as a unifying factor. And I think young people today are very disillusioned with the democratic society and democratic government, and that's unfortunate. And I think if more people understood the importance of what our country was founded on, we might be able to unite in an effort to realize that there is a threat to us and that we are what's left to fight it, to combat it effectively. An ideological offensive is important to realize, or to have people realize, that there is someone to answer to. No matter what your denomination or your belief is, there's somebody above man, and I think that reestablishes moral convictions and makes you more responsible in your actions.
This organization is capable of not only providing the answers, but of getting the job done, and mostly has the dedication, which is apparent in someone like Colonel Park. That man's incredible.
The CAUSA worldview and what I believe as a Catholic priest and going through the seminary and my training in all my Catholic years of education, I find it very compatible. There are many organizations that are fighting the same battle in different ways, but the emphasis that CAUSA presents is certainly the one that I think I'm most in agreement with as an umbrella group, as a way of drawing in groups from all the God-fearing people. And certainly in the cause of humanity, I think we all have to unite under a common cause. I don't think we have to sacrifice our individual religious convictions, and I don't intend to, but there's no attempt made to persuade me to do that. And I find that what is presented in the lectures and in the material is very compatible, and all the disclaimers were made that if at any point there's something you cannot accept, you're perfectly free to not accept that point. And I feel nobody can ask for anything fairer.
For a long time, I've been very concerned about the direction that America has gone in the destruction of our Constitution. That has worried me, and I have felt that it was necessary for us to join actively with all good citizens who are concerned with the threat that communism is to not only to this country, but to the peace and freedom of the world. And I can see that this is the purpose of CAUSA, is to educate not only the people of this country, but to educate the people of the world to recognize the evils of communism, and that the only way to fight it is to join together and recognize God as the source of our liberties. God is our Father, He is our Creator, and communism is the greatest force of evil in the world today, to destroy a belief in God and to destroy the peace and freedom of all countries. And so God is important to me as an individual, and I can see that the people that are supporting this movement, it's obvious to me that God is important to them also.
But more important, I think what I have carried back from CAUSA is a deep-seated sense of hope. My logic, my human rationality tells me that I'm looking at a force which is literally an unstoppable force, which has grown and become so monstrous that there's nothing short of all-out war and a disaster to attempt to stop them. And I see here a new approach, a hopeful approach. And so CAUSA emerged at a time because it was needed. And because it's meeting a need, I believe it's going to be successful. And therefore I am enjoying being and becoming more and more a part of it.
I would say that the education on the nature of communism is outstanding. I have been studying communism for a lifetime. I had my first debate with a communist in the year 1940, and I've conducted many anti-communist seminars in schools, but your technique of using graphics so magnificently and presenting relevant information, accurate information, is outstanding, and I am learning a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen, how did you find our introduction to the CAUSA program? I hope that you enjoyed it. I also hope that this introduction inspired you to watch the CAUSA programs which will follow in this series. I'm sure that it's going to be interesting, exciting, and intellectually and spiritually rewarding. I sincerely hope that you will enjoy the entire CAUSA program, and most especially, I look forward to the day when I have the chance to meet you in person. Thank you once again, and may God bless you.
Hello, and welcome again to CAUSA International. I hope that you enjoyed the first video presentation, which gave you some idea of CAUSA and of CAUSA's work. I'm very happy that I can be able to share some time with you during the course of these CAUSA presentations. My name is Tom Ward, and I'm the Vice President of CAUSA International, and I'm very honored that I will be serving as your host during the course of these CAUSA video presentations. We would like to begin with perhaps the most important portion of our presentation. What we would like to begin by talking about is, why is CAUSA so concerned about the problem of communism? Certainly, there must be a reason. And in this first presentation, we want to address this fundamental point. That's why we have entitled this first presentation, Communist Expansionism and the West. Can you believe that in 67 years, communism has come to control 40% of the world's land territory, and likewise it has come to control approximately 40% of the world's population? Can you believe that in the past 10 years, 15 more nations have fallen into Marxism-Leninism? This process has continued onward and onward. And we have to look for answers. We have to find what it is that's responsible for this kind of a phenomenon. In this presentation, I would like to speak on the basis of some of CAUSA's own experiences. As you've already come to understand through our first presentation, CAUSA International began in Latin America. It's a young part of the world. In a lot of the ways we can say that it's a land of tremendous hope. But at the same time, even though there is this youth and this hope, the reality is that Latin America is confronting very serious problems. Problems such as political corruption, poverty, social injustice. And we can't deny the reality of those problems. And many people inside of Latin America are tremendously frustrated because of those problems, and they've decided that within their own system, they can never be successful in changing them. They've therefore committed their very lives to radical change. They're dedicated, they're young, they're idealistic. They've united around a new generation of heroes, people such as Fidel Castro, Lenin, and Mao Zedong. Their rallying point, their banner, is a pledge and a commitment to social justice. They pledge to build a better world, a just world. But the time has come to ask whether, in fact, Marxist revolutions in nation after nation, whether or not these revolutions have been successful in bringing the desired objective of a better world. Let's take some examples. Look at Castro's Cuba. What has Castro's Cuba produced? Well, most of all, they've produced refugees. 1 million refugees out of a population of 9 million people. And what otherwise? Castro's political prisons are infamous. And likewise, more than 10,000 Cuban young men and women have died on African soil. For what? To advance Soviet expansionism and nothing else. Or, if you will, let's take the example of Nicaragua. Supposedly this was a different kind of revolution. But what's happened inside of Nicaragua? We all heard so much about the corruption inside of Somoza's Nicaragua. Certainly that corruption was real. We're not going to defend that. We're not going to say that those situations which occurred didn't occur. But the point is that things were supposed to change. There was so much petty thievery in Somoza's Nicaragua that the Sandinistas said, once we come to power, we'll end those kinds of problems. We'll make a just society. And they adopted as their motto, the dawn has ceased to be a temptation. Supposedly, there was no longer a need to steal. There was no longer a need to pillage. But what has actually happened since the time of the Sandinista takeover? Scarcity abounds, nothing else. Even scarcity of the most fundamental products. Soap, meat, bread. One of the local newspapers inside of Nicaragua, one which still has some degree of freedom, La Prensa, has joked about the situation. They mentioned, for example, that today it's impossible to get toothpaste even inside of Nicaragua. And they say that because of this problem, instead of saying today that the dawn has ceased to be a temptation, that due to the lack of toothpaste, maybe they should say the kiss has ceased to be a temptation. Nation after nation, where communism has grown, there has been a scarcity of goods, there has been more corruption, and there has also been brutality in case after case. And so we have to ask, is this pattern going to continue? Is communism going to continue to grow and to develop as it has in the past 67 years? Well, it is if we don't come to deal with and grapple with certain realities which surround us. I'd like to ask you, if you could, to bear with me for a short period of time, because I'd like to speak about some problems which we in CAUSA see as very real problems. What we see in CAUSA is a pattern which has been repeated in nation after nation where communism has taken power. What is the pattern, you might ask? Well, basically the pattern revolves around a certain kind of a formula. You can take a country. You can take any country where communism has grown and developed. Let's take the case of Nicaragua. You can find that there are two forces that were responsible for the communization of Nicaragua. One of those forces was communistic propaganda. But the other force was our own Western liberal media. These two forces were experts in doing one thing, in exposing the corruption of the status quo. And there was, as I've already said, a lot of corruption. But they failed to do one thing, it would seem. What they failed to do was to see whether those who were fighting to change the system had a solution. Could they change the situation, or could they not change the situation? If they couldn't, then just to focus on bringing down one government without being certain that there was something to replace it was truly a tragic error. This kind of a pattern, we believe, has been repeated over and over and over again. There's not much of a question about it. And it doesn't even apply just to communism. We can take another example from this century where someone spoke very strongly about the problems of the status quo, and that person, likewise, was very successful over a period of time in gaining a lot of popular support because he could point out the problems of the status quo, and there was not enough of an effort to find out whether or not that person brought a solution. I'd like to go over that historical example. After World War I, there were serious problems inside of the Weimar Republic of Germany. There was a real scarcity of goods. There was incredible inflation. Over a period of 2 years, the German Deutschmark went from 162 Deutschmarks per dollar to millions of Deutschmarks per dollar. An incredible problem of inflation. People joked about the problem. There was a story of a man, for example, who wanted to know if there was an honest German. And so what he did was he filled a whole barrel with Deutschmarks. And he went away for an hour. And when he came back after an hour, he found that someone had stolen the barrel. Why didn't they take the Deutschmarks? Because they weren't worth anything. One man spoke very strongly about the corruption of the Weimar Republic. He was, so to speak, a man of the people. He was dedicated to his cause. Day after day, he spoke about the corruption of the status quo. And he began to gather audiences. When he gathered for the first time 100 people, for him it was an amazing, outstanding success. And finally, on the 30th of January 1933, this man, Adolf Hitler, came to be the Chancellor of Germany. Some people were concerned. They'd heard about what he had said in Mein Kampf. They were worried. But he tried to allay the people. And in his inaugural address, he declared that Christianity would be the center of his government's moral conception. And amazingly, he spoke more and more about the corruption of the status quo, and opinions about him also began to change. In 1935, for example, the New York Times Book Review made a glowing report about Adolf Hitler. It said, Hitler is doing much for Germany. His unification of the Germans, his training of the young, his creation of a Spartan state animated by patriotism, his curbing of parliamentary government so unsuited to the German character, his protection of the rights of private property, all these things are good. Amazingly, in the same year, even Winston Churchill began to praise Hitler for his courage, his perseverance, and the vital force that permitted him to challenge all the resistance that blocked his path. Praise for Hitler. And at the same time, Hitler proceeded to build a military machine. Every day, stronger and stronger, that machine. He talked about the corruption of the status quo, and people were sympathetic for that reason. And then he began to say that his people needed more living space. And he began to absorb territory after territory. The Saar one day, Sudetenland another day, the rest of Czechoslovakia another day, half of Poland another day. And there was so much indifference to that kind of a situation. As a matter of fact, there were many people that said, don't worry about Hitler, let's worry about ourselves, let's worry about our own problems, let's worry about our own corruption. In 1940, President of University of Chicago, Robert Maynard Hutchins, declared, it is easier for us to blame Hitler for our troubles than to fight for democracy at home. Don't worry about Hitler, let's worry about our own problems. That's what's important. And Hitler grew and became more and more powerful, and then one day he gave his troops the order, march. And they did march all over Europe. They came to control most of Western Europe and a large portion of Northern Africa as well. And finally, what did it take us to stop Hitler? It cost the lives of 50 million human beings. And that was only a part of the tragedy. Because when the Allied troops marched into Dachau, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, they discovered another tragedy. 6 to 12 million people who had been senselessly killed because of a meaningless ideology. What was the essence of the lesson there? What can we learn from Hitler? One basic thing, an important thing for us to learn. Hitler exposed the corruption which was real, but he did not bring a solution. There was no relationship between the corruption of the Weimar Republic and Nazism. No rapport whatsoever. And so today, as we see the advance of communism in nation after nation after nation, we must ask a question. Is there a rapport between exposing the corruption and communism? Let's see the lessons of history. And on the basis of that, we can make our own determination. What do we see if we study history? Well, what we find in nation after nation where communism has grown and developed is brutality. Between 1917 and 1923, Vladimir Lenin was responsible for the deaths of 1.8 million people. Or take the case of China. At the time of Mao's takeover of Tibet, in order to wipe out religious forces there, he pounded nails into the eyes of the Buddhist priests there to suppress the development of Buddhism in that important part of the world. 3 to 4 million deaths in North Korea for that nation to be communized. Can we forget Hungary of 1956? Czechoslovakia of 1968? Can we forget the senseless genocide in Southeast Asia after 1975, which left millions of orphans? Or can we forget the senseless terrorism which we find today in Peru, in Central America? In nation after nation, we find the same tragic story of a senseless loss of human lives where communism has grown and developed. What is the result of communism? 67 years of communism. Fundamentally, let's take, first of all, the Soviet Union. 67 years of communism in the Soviet Union has taken 70 million human lives. Since 1949, approximately 67 million lives were lost in China. 3 million lives in Cambodia. Take other nations. Afghanistan, 2 million. East Germany after World War II, 2.5 million. Ethiopia, 1 million at least. Vietnam, 1 million. North Korea, 3 to 4 million. Angola, 150,000. If you will, from these other nations, at least another 10 million, or a total of 150 million dead. And yet, what has been the response? 150 million dead. We know that Hitler killed 6 to 12 million completely innocent victims, but communism has taken the lives of 150 million people in 67 years. What can justify that kind of behavior? What can justify that dimension of atrocity? Absolutely nothing. And yet what has been the attitude of the West? Time and time again. Because the communists have spoken about the corruption of the status quo, we have blindly acceded to their advance in nation after nation. Let's just cite some examples. At the time, for example, of Lenin coming to power, he was heralded as a champion, the one who had stopped the danger of Tsarism inside of Russia. Even Stalin, the attitude towards the Stalin was amazing. Walter Duranty in the New York Times during the 1930s wrote so many positive articles about Joseph Stalin. We learned, for example, Stalin is not a dictator, as one headline said. We learned that Stalin was a man who was truly a great leader. We learn, according to Walter Duranty, with respect to Stalin, quote, "Verily he is like steel, smooth and resilient, not hard or brittle like iron." Joseph Stalin, why was he heralded? Why was he seen as smooth and resilient? Because he spoke about the problems of the status quo, and we didn't seek enough to find out whether or not he had a solution to those problems. When communism came to our hemisphere, precisely the same thing. The New York Times, beginning in 1957, with a reporter by the name of Herbert Matthews, wrote article after article about the corruption which was existing inside of Batista's Cuba. We heard glowing reports about a man who was committed to social justice and democracy by the name of Fidel Castro. And when finally, on the 1st of January 1959, this man Castro arrived at Havana, the New York Times had only positive words for him. An editorial which appeared on the 2nd of January, speaking of Castro, said, "One thing must be said. This is an acknowledgement to an extraordinary young man, Fidel Castro. The American people wish him good fortune." And 2 days later, they gave exactly the same kind of commentary about Che Guevara. They spoke of Che Guevara saying, quote, "His voice is incredibly low and his smile unexpectedly gentle." They quoted Che saying, "I have never been a communist. Dictators always say that their enemies are communist, and it gave me pain to be called an international communist all the time." And yet the reality is that 2 years prior to that, already Che Guevara had said, "I am among those who believe that the solution to the problems of the world will be found behind the Iron Curtain." We paid no heed because they spoke about the problems of the status quo. With respect to Vietnam, precisely the same thing. We heard so much about the corruption of the Diem regime, of the Thieu regime. We heard glowing reports about there was a broad coalition that was fighting democratic forces largely, who wanted to change the situation. People who had adopted the Declaration of Independence of the United States as their example. That was the report that we got. And when finally Vietnam fell, the New York Times declared, quote, "The South Vietnamese regime has a non-aligned foreign policy of peace and non-commitments." A non-aligned foreign policy. And yet today, Vietnamese children study Russian rather than French or English. Non-alignment, and yet today, more than 500,000 Vietnamese are working to build the Soviet pipeline. With respect to Cambodia, the same thing again. We heard so much about the corruption of the Lon Nol government. Week after week, month after month, year after year. And when finally that government fell, the 17th of April 1975, the New York Times declared, "Must the futile battle for Phnom Penh now be duplicated at the far greater cost in lives in a fight to the finish in Saigon? There is nothing in human power which can redeem the hundreds of deaths, the thousands of ruined lives, the tragic result of the last weeks around the Cambodian capital." The New York Times lamented hundreds of lives. And with the fall of Cambodia, we didn't see the loss of hundreds of lives, but the loss of millions of lives. 3 to 4 million lives. Once again, in our zeal to expose the corruption of the status quo, we opened the way to a genocide. It's interesting to note that in 1976, the same New York Times wrote 61 articles about human rights violations in Chile and 3 articles about human rights violations in Cambodia. Chile, where 2,000 people at the most were killed, Cambodia, where 4 million people were killed. Why? Because of this constant blindness, only focusing upon the corruption of the status quo and not an effort to see what follows as nation after nation is victimized by communism. When communism returned to our hemisphere, we find precisely the same problem. In April 1979, when Grenada was taken by Maurice Bishop, Time magazine spoke over and over of the corruption of the former Gary government. We heard amazing things about the corruption of that government. And then Time magazine naively declared that the government of Maurice Bishop would follow a policy focusing upon moderate socialist reform. Moderate socialist reform, we heard. And yet it was by December of 1979 that 1,000 Cubans had already entered Grenada, where they were training a security force for Suriname, which soon after also became a Marxist state. Or, another example which is very close to us is the case of Nicaragua. The Western press and communist propaganda told us day after day about the corruption of the Somoza government. We heard that the forces of the Sandinistas were Christian in character. This was not a communist revolution. And as a matter of fact, Time magazine wrote article after article about the situation of Somoza and naively declared in July 1979 the Nicaraguan junta appointed a 15-member cabinet dominated by moderates. Dominated by moderates. That's what we heard. And a few days after that, July 26, 1979, President Jimmy Carter declared, "In no way do I attribute the changes in Nicaragua to Cuba." The New York Times, the 27th of July, 1979, naively declared that these words by Jimmy Carter constituted his, quote, diplomatic high note. His diplomatic high note indeed. We began to send funds to Nicaragua. What did those funds serve? First of all, the formation of a security force which in fact did only one thing. It consolidated the communist revolution there. We also financed a literary program there, a literacy program there. A literacy program where the first word that children learned was revolution. The second word they learned was liberation. And their first sentence was, "Long live the Sandinista Liberation Front." Once again, another nation had been betrayed. Today, the focus is El Salvador. We hear all kinds of reports about the death squads of the right. We hear all kinds of reports about the corruption which exists in the government inside of El Salvador. This is the focus. People say that it's essential today that there be negotiation, a broad front to involve the opposition and the government which exists. Through this negotiation, it's the only way that a true solution can be found to the problems in Nicaragua. But what does history teach us about this kind of pattern? People are speaking of the need today for a coalition government. But what is the focus of the communists when they speak of a coalition government? We can understand if we study the Soviet Encyclopedia. They give a clear definition of a coalition government. They refer to it as a people's democracy. And they explain that in any people's democracy there are two forces which are involved. One is the communist, and the other is the non-communist. They proceed to explain there that the communists should seek a certain kind of post in the government. Not the presidency, not the vice presidency. The military and the security post. Let the non-communists have all the other posts and positions. Because once the communists have the firepower, they can begin to put all kinds of force on the opposition. They can begin to force the other people to abandon their positions, and ultimately everything will become red. This is what happened in Vietnam. We heard so much about a certain Madame Binh, but where is Madame Binh today? Well, Madame Binh had no position in the Vietnamese army, and so she's been removed from that government. When Fidel Castro came to Cuba, he didn't come there as the president, not at all. He came as the minister of the army. That's where he began. He chose someone else as a puppet, and at the appropriate time he put pressure on that man, and that man is gone. In the case of the Sandinista takeover, the same thing. Violeta Chamorro was paraded before the people. This wonderful woman was paraded as a representative of democracy. And in the meantime, individuals such as Tomás Borge and Humberto Ortega proceeded to take the security posts, such as the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of the Defense. Where is Violeta Chamorro today? Where is Alfonso Rebelo today? Where were the moderate forces inside of the Nicaraguan government? They have all disappeared. That is the reality. Now, some people might say, what you're speaking about, though, that isn't real communism. That's something quite different from communism. In our country, they'll say, things are going to be different. We're going to build here a true communist society. We're going to base our work upon the words of Marx and the works of Lenin. We're not talking about Stalinism. The examples you've given up until now, everything that you've spoken about, they would say to me, that's Stalinism. That's not real communism. That's not real Leninism. That's not real Marxism. That they might argue. But such people need to remind themselves of the lessons of history. What provoked the Holocaust? Basically, the cause of the Holocaust can be found in one book, Mein Kampf. And either people didn't read Mein Kampf, or they didn't take the words there seriously. And what about the words of the famous Marxist-Leninist mentors? What did they say? Well, let's go back to Lenin's words, for example. The communists often speak about peace, but what is peace in accord with the communist definition of it? In the words of Lenin, the policy of the Soviet Union is a policy of peace. It is merely another form under the present condition to fight against capitalism. Or we hear often about détente and peaceful coexistence. But what is peaceful coexistence for the communist? In Lenin's words, quote, peaceful coexistence is a revolutionary line, a revolutionary strategy. The purpose of the strategy of peaceful coexistence is to assure the conditions favorable to the victory of world socialism. Some people naively believe that communism follows the same kind of moral code as we have. But what was Lenin's view on morality? Well, if we go back to the first All-Russian Youth Congress in 1919, we find Lenin's position on morality. And it's the same position we find today in Afanasyev's book on Marxist philosophy, published in 1980 by Moscow publishers. From the point of view of communist morality, that which promotes the movement of society towards communism is moral. Anything that allows communism to be promoted is moral. If spying promotes communism, it's moral. If violating treaties promotes communism, it's moral. If genocide promotes communism, it's moral. This is from communist literature, 1980. Exactly the same definition that Lenin gave. Lots of people speak today about the need to negotiate. They speak about the need to make the option for peace, that we must take the first step. But what is the Marxist view precisely on peace? What's precisely their view on the so-called peace movement? Let's go back to the words of Dmitry Manuilsky, three-time Lenin Prize winner and professor at the Lenin School of Peace. Already in 1930, Manuilsky said, "War unto the death is inevitable between communism and capitalism. At the present time, however, we are not strong enough to attack them. Our time will come within 20 or 30 years. In order to win, we will need the surprise factor. We must put the bourgeoisie to sleep. For that reason, we will begin the most spectacular peace movement that history has ever seen. We will make proposals and concessions as have never been known. Because the capitalist nations are stupid and decadent, they will do everything possible to have us as their friend. And as soon as they drop their guard, we will smash them with our closed fist." If that quote seems too distant, that was in 1930, let's consider the words of Brezhnev in 1973, speaking on the topic of détente. Brezhnev said, "Trust in us, comrades, because by 1985, as a result of what we are accomplishing through détente, we will have accomplished a major part of our objective for Western Europe. By 1985, we will have consolidated our position. By 1985, we will be ready to exert our will wherever we wish." Brezhnev said that to a small group of associates of the Eastern Bloc nations in 1973. Today, the communists are not just having objectives in Western Europe. Their focus is our own hemisphere. In his book, Les Maîtres de Cuba, The Masters of Cuba, former DGI, that's a Cuban KGB, agent, Juan Vives, speaks of the situation of Castro's Cuba. Vives observes that many people in the West think that Castro is still non-aligned. But he points out that the first Congress of the Cuban Communist Party was presided over in 1975, not by Fidel Castro, but by the gentleman you see here in this picture between Fidel and Raúl Castro, Fabio Gubart, one of the co-founders of the Soviet KGB. Vives points out that it is not by chance that the Soviets chose Cuba. It is almost equidistant between North America, South America, and Central America. And particularly, a major strategic objective was accomplished through the communization today of Nicaragua. Why? Because for the first time today, the Soviets have the possibility, through MiG-23s, to control the strategic sea routes in the Caribbean for the United States. This is the same area that was so important during World War II for Adolf Hitler to attempt to control. Precisely the same place. And today, the Soviets, through Nicaragua and Cuba, have access to that area. The Nicaraguans are concerned about advancing a communist ideal throughout the Caribbean, throughout Central America, and even up to Mexico. In a recent interview, Minister of the Interior Tomás Borge was asked, "Is it true, as President Reagan says, that the objective of Nicaragua is Mexico?" Borge responded by saying, "For once, President Reagan was correct." The communists have clear objectives. They have built an army in Nicaragua of 105,000 soldiers. At the high point of Somoza's government, there were 12,000 soldiers in Nicaragua. Yet today, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas are building towards an army of 250,000 men. For what? For what reason? What motivates them? Neighboring Honduras has 18,000 soldiers. Neighboring Costa Rica has no army at all. Why then does Nicaragua need an army of 250,000 men and women? Why are they building this incredible force? Where is this force going? What is its objective? Well, perhaps this graffiti gives the answer. Ayer Nicaragua, yesterday Nicaragua, hoy El Salvador, today El Salvador, mañana Guatemala, tomorrow Guatemala. In other words, the objective is all of Central America. And Fidel Castro has even bigger ambitions. The communization of Mexico, which already Borges has spoken about. And does it all stop there? No. Already Castro has invested a lot of money and people in a campaign throughout the southwestern part of the United States, speaking about the need of the liberation of Aztlan. What is Aztlan exactly? Well, it's a territory that Castro and his agents maintain must be returned to the Hispanic peoples. What territory are we talking about? We're talking about California, Nevada, Utah, Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona. This is Aztlan. And does it even stop there? No, it doesn't stop there either. Recently, the Ukrainian Labor Home, a Soviet front in New York, spoke about the need for the liberation of New Africa. What is New Africa? New Africa is Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama. Talking about this territory, once again supported by the Soviets. The Soviet objectives are clear. They were made clear in 1917. In order for the communist ideal to be accomplished, the world must be communized. They can't stop short of that. It's interesting to note that after World War II, the Soviet negotiator, Litvinov, was asked the question by Richard C. Hotlet, what would you Soviets do if the United States accepted all of your requests? What would you do? Litvinov said, we would wait a while, and then we'd ask for more concessions. The Soviet goal is clear. And the Soviet fruit of 67 years is genocide. What do we in the West do? The first thing that we have to do is we have to deal with our own reality. We can't forget the past. In 1975, the United States, like it or not, lost the war in Vietnam. Now, some people want to ignore that. They say, no more Vietnams. We can say no more Vietnams, but people such as Che Guevara says 2, 3, many Vietnams. We say no more Vietnams, and we stand by while Angola is communized, while Mozambique is communized. We stand by while Cambodia is communized, while Grenada is communized, while Nicaragua is communized. We have stood by and we have seen nation after nation which has fallen into communism. We must respond to that situation. If we don't, this situation will continue. We will see the fall of Central America. We will see the fall of Mexico, and our own borders will be very clearly threatened. Red Dawn will not just be some kind of a myth. It can become a reality. It can become a reality if we don't awaken in America. Therefore, we need in this country today real introspection. Why did Vietnam fall? Was it because of a lack of weapons? Not at all. When we abandoned the South Vietnam, we left behind $5 billion stockpiled in weapons. Was it because of a lack of economic development? Not at all. For years after the fall of Saigon, the North did not permit many people to go south because they thought they'd be scandalized when they saw the level of economic development which existed in the South. Was it because of a lack of political freedom? Not even that. There was a free press in South Vietnam. There was a right to assembly in South Vietnam. There was likewise even an attempt to have a democracy in South Vietnam. Certainly it wasn't perfect, but there was an attempt at least. Much more freedom there than in many of the other nations in that part of Asia. What then was it that provoked the fall of Vietnam? Fundamentally, one thing. We had no purpose to fight. We had no purpose to fight. The war in Vietnam was not lost on the battlefields. It was lost in Washington, D.C. Soldiers gave their lives, but here in America, there was no ideological purpose or direction or reason to fight. There was confusion. And when we see that confusion and we compare it to the zeal of those who are committed to communism, there's an incredible gap. Let's take the case, for example, of the communization of China. Mao Zedong began with 30,000 soldiers. When he began his long march, he saw soldier after soldier perish in the midst of the march. When they finally got to Peking, only 8,000 made it. And when they got there, Mao gathered those soldiers and said, "Don't think that now your lives will be easier. They won't be easier. But I can promise you one thing, the lives of your children will be easier." And when they were out on the long march, sometimes they had nothing to eat. And they came to Mao and said, "What can we do?" He said, "Take the leather from your shoes, cook it, and eat it." Why did they have that kind of dedication? What was the reason that they were that committed to give their lives? What provoked that? Many people say Marxism doesn't work. Certainly Marxism doesn't work, but Leninism does. Leninism has been successful in nation after nation for coming to power. It shows a formula for people to take power in country after country. And there is a relationship between Marxism and Leninism. And that relationship is a relationship of cause to effect. Leninism, in essence, is extremely utilitarian. Any way or means to get power, to keep power, use it. That's what Leninism teaches. But at the same time, Marxism itself gives an apologetic, gives a reason for this kind of behavior. Because Marxism says, you have the absolute truth. You have the way to usher in a new age. You have a way to end the suffering of mankind. Indeed, various individuals have spoken about the fact that Marxism and its tenets have the ability to give people a religious zeal. The famous French philosopher André Gide speaks about his own experience with Marxism. He explains about to what extent he was inspired by Marxism. He says, "My conversion is like a faith. All my being is directed to a single goal. In the deplorable state of the modern world, the plan of the Soviet Union seems to constitute the salvation of humanity." Che Guevara spoke about the same kind of near religious experience that Marxism gave to him. He said, "My Marxism has taken root within me and been purified. I believe in armed struggle as the only solution to those who wish to liberate themselves, and I am faithful to my beliefs." Marxism has that capacity. It gives people a direction. And if we compare the power of the communist world to the situation of the West, we find an incredible dichotomy. On one side, people with an ideology which gives them a purpose to go forward, a purpose to give their lives. And on the other side, we find people that are totally confused, a drug culture, young people that find themselves without purpose and without aim or direction. We have seen even a theater of the absurd emerge in the West, because life seems to have no purpose or value. What do we do? What do we do about this situation? This is the fundamental concern of CAUSA. We feel that what has been lacking in the struggle against communism has been the ideological direction which is necessary if we are to be successful. We in the West must have a purpose. We in the West must re-examine the basis of our own value system. Let's draw our conclusion. We've made a lot of points during this presentation, but what is the fundamental point? First and foremost, communism offers no solution to the problems of mankind. What is the fruit of 67 years of communism? Well, for Cuba and for Vietnam, the fruit is both people. For Cambodia, it's millions of children without any parents because of the Cambodian Holocaust. It's terrorists in the Middle East. And it's tens of thousands of deaths in Central America. Or maybe a more graphic example for all of us, an event that occurred not so long ago, KAL 007. What is the fruit of 67 years of communism? In December 1982, a very interesting article appeared in Forbes magazine. It mentioned that after 60-some years of communism, what had the Soviets arrived at doing? They had achieved one thing. They had realized a long march to nowhere. From the viewpoint of economics, the Soviets have accomplished almost nothing. From the viewpoint of medical technology, they've made very, very few advances. Even from the viewpoint of science, their technological developments have all been predicated upon the robbery of technology from the West. What is the reality of Soviet industry? What is the reality of the situation in the Soviet Union? There are so many anecdotes and stories, and I'd like to share with you just one story. It concerns a Soviet dissident who dedicated his entire life to opposition to the Soviet Union. And finally, the poor man passed away. And when he passed away, he was called before the gates of St. Peter. And when he went before the gates of St. Peter, he learned that his name wasn't on the reservation list for the kingdom of heaven. That meant he had to go, of course, to someplace else. And for that reason, St. Peter wanted at least to comfort him somehow. And he said, don't worry, though, because actually there are two hells. There's not just one. There is a Soviet hell, and there's a free world hell. And you can decide where you want to go to. You can go to the Soviet hell, or you can go to the free world hell. It's completely up to you. And so the dissident said, please explain to me the difference between the two hells. And St. Peter said, well, in the free world's hell, you have a machine that spits fire, that gives electrical shocks, and that boils water up to your neck. And the dissident said, well, what about the Soviet hell? And St. Peter explained, there you also have a machine that spits fire, that gives electrical shocks, and that boils water up to your neck. And then St. Peter said, so which would you rather have? The free world hell or the Soviet hell? The dissident didn't hesitate for a moment. He immediately replied by saying, I definitely want to go to the Soviet hell. And St. Peter was flabbergasted. He said, why do you want to go to the Soviet hell? And the dissident said, for one simple reason. After many, many experiences inside the Soviet Union, I'm certain of one thing. When I get to the Soviet hell, I'm sure I'll find out that the machine isn't working. Why isn't it working? Simple. Because Marxism isn't working. Marxism, the ideology itself, is based upon 17th and 18th century science. It's not based upon a modern perspective. Communists still proclaim that their view is scientific. We have attacked the atrocities of communism. We have attacked the leaders of communism. But we have not stopped communism. Why is that? Because we have not recognized and understood the true Achilles heel of communism. What is that Achilles heel? Amazingly, the Achilles heel of communism is the ideology itself. It is based upon a 17th and 18th century view of science. In light of Einstein's theory of relativity, in light of development in so many different areas, such as molecular biology, it becomes manifestly clear that the Marxist worldview does not conform to 20th century reality. As a matter of fact, as there is more scientific discovery, it becomes more and more evident that a materialistic viewpoint is not sufficient to explain reality. More and more, scientists begin to recognize that there is a transcendent reality beyond that which is perceived through the material senses. This is the true Achilles heel, and this is the focus of CAUSA, the Marxist ideology itself. We're not here to condemn and accuse Stalin. We're not here to accuse Marx because he stole books out of the London Library. That's not our focus. Our focus is something very, very fundamental. The ideology itself, Marxism, does not conform to reality. The communists, as we've noted, are experts in pointing out the corruption of the status quo, but they have no solution. It's kind of like showing that a person is sick and prescribing arsenic to cure the person. That's what communism is. And what we want to do during the course of the CAUSA presentations is precisely that. We want to examine the Marxist ideology, and we believe that you will conclude with us that the ideology itself is founded upon a fallacious viewpoint. We within CAUSA, therefore, are very optimistic and hopeful. We've presented a grim reality, but we're actually hopeful for a number of reasons. First of all, we're hopeful because even within the Soviet Union, people are beginning to awaken to the reality that there is a fundamental contradiction between science and Marxism. We are hopeful also because in nations such as France, a whole generation of young people has emerged. People who were very strongly linked with Marxism in the 1960s, but who today have taken a radically different position. Because of Solzhenitsyn, because of Prague, they felt they had to ask, why did those things happen? And their conclusion was the ideology itself provoked those kinds of situations. We also are hopeful because here in America, various organizations and groups are beginning to ask a fundamental question. Who are we? What do we represent? What do we want to accomplish? What do we stand for? This document from the Council for Inter-American Security, for example, points out the need today to develop an American worldview. There is an introspection which is occurring today in America. There are people today who are asking basic questions about our values, about what we stand for, what we represent in America, what we have to defend, what we have to share. This is tremendously important. We in CAUSA are optimistic because of this. And also we are hopeful because we have a president today who understands the reality of communism. For the first time in decades, we have gone 4 years without even one nation falling into communism. And not only that, but for the first time in 67 years of communist history, one nation has been liberated from communism, Grenada. It was a tiny nation, but this was truly a monumental event in the history of freedom, and likewise in the history of communism. Finally, one nation was freed. We are inspired by this reality, and we believe that in the future, many nations will be freed. Many nations will ultimately be liberated from the danger and the threat of communism. We in CAUSA, therefore, are optimistic people. We are hopeful people. And I believe that through the CAUSA presentations, which hopefully you will share with us, you also will be inspired. The presentations begin with a survey of the Marxist ideology, and likewise a critique of that ideology. They follow afterwards with a study of a very exciting perspective known as the CAUSA worldview. I would like to encourage you to please share with us. I would like to thank you for participating in this CAUSA video presentation program, and I hope that you will see the whole of the program. I believe that through seeing the whole series of presentations, you will be deeply inspired and motivated and filled with a new sense of optimism. Thank you very much. Hello, and welcome to the continuation of the CAUSA program. What you are about to view is a video recording of a program which was done by CAUSA in Washington, D.C. in May of 1984. It involved approximately 200 participants from all over the United States. I think that you will find that this program will give you a good idea of the kind of format which CAUSA has used to educate more than 30,000 people throughout our hemisphere. Our first speaker will be Mr. William Lay. William is the director of the CAUSA Institute, and he also serves as the editor of the CAUSA magazine. Bill was trained as a chemist, and he studied under Nobel laureate Herbert Brown. In this first presentation, he will be speaking on the formation and the development of communist theory. I hope that you will enjoy this first expose on the development of communist theory.
Well, good morning to you once again. This is a more familiar role for me, and so I actually feel more at ease when I'm about to present the material that our institute has researched and developed and that we feel is valuable to you. Like Tom, I really feel very much in a humble position speaking to you. Actually, I wasn't even involved in this effort at the time when many of you had already been involved for a number of years. When I was studying chemistry, I really wasn't aware of the importance of this whole field and wasn't aware of the acute situation that our world is in. So compared to many of you, I'm a newcomer, and I'm aware of that. And yet, I am confident that the material that we've been developing in the Institute can be valuable to all of you. So I'm happy to be able to have this opportunity to present it. This presentation is actually a two-part presentation, and we'll be having the first part before lunch, and we'll reserve the second part, concluding part, for after lunch. Can we have the light down, please? The name of the two-part presentation is Marxist Ideology, Overview and Critique. In the most recent issue of the Dr. Fred Schwartz's newsletter of the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, he makes some comments about the role of ideology in the Soviet Union, and I'd like to share those with you. We've had contact with a number of dissidents who've emerged from the Soviet Union. Mr. Zinoviev spoke at our CAUSA conference in Europe. Mr. Mikhail Makarenko frequently appears at our CAUSA USA conferences, and other dissidents have come. And it's very interesting because only by hearing a number of views can you begin to comprehend the role that ideology plays in the Soviet Union. It's a very important factor, and yet it's a complex role that the Marxist ideology plays. But Dr. Schwartz put it very simply. He said that rising up in the leadership of the Soviet Union is like progressing through a tennis tournament. So you have to go through various rounds and matches and heats, and finally you move toward the finals. And there are different players with many different styles of play, like, for example, Bjorn Borg or John McEnroe. But one thing they have in common, they're good at tennis. And he said, indeed, in the Soviet Union or another communist country, you'll find different personalities and different styles of leadership. But in order to advance, they have to be good Marxist ideologues. They have to know Marxism, Leninism, and be good at it and practice it. Furthermore, Marxist ideology is important for us to understand because it can be selectively taught in the various parts of the world. Certain portions of Marxist ideology that we'll talk about later today, such as the economic theories, are being taught in Nicaragua, while certain other concepts may be taught in another place, just as the situation demands. So we'll be spending time in this presentation to overview the entire Marxist ideology and critique it, and then we'll take time later on in the program to look at the specific parts. Now, of course, when we talk about Marxism or communism, we're talking about a program that has been progressively defined and developed over a number of years. And there have been a number of divisions in the Marxist family tree. After the death of Marx and Engels, for example, there was a dispute between Bernstein, the German Marxist, and Lenin. Bernstein, who challenged the economic theories of Marx and said that there were flaws in those theories, and furthermore said that socialism could be brought about through democratic means. And Lenin, who defended Marx's economic theories, said that a violent revolution was essential, and even talked about passing over the stage of capitalism and going directly from feudalism into socialism. Later on, there was another dispute, this time between Lenin and Karl Kautsky, having to do with who would be a member of the party, with Lenin holding out that a party member had to be a totally dedicated professional revolutionary. After the death of Lenin, we might mention the split between Trotsky, who talked about worldwide revolution, and Stalin, who insisted upon consolidating power within the Soviet Union. And the death of Stalin gives us an interesting insight into the communist world. At that point, Mao Zedong was perhaps the natural successor in terms of the central communist leader. He was like the elder brother of the communist world and had brought communism to China. And yet, Mao was pushed aside in terms of world leadership by Nikita Khrushchev, showing that communism really does not transcend questions of race and nationality. In any event, this is not a complete discussion of all the divisions. These are just some representative splits. It shows us that communism is a complex thing with many different nuances and interpretations. However, the key point is that all Marxism-Leninism has to trace back to the thought and writings of Karl Marx. So we will be talking about Marxist ideology. We'll be talking about the thought of Karl Marx in this discussion. In this two-part presentation, then, we will cover certain influences which affected Marx when he was formulating his thought. We'll also talk about the chronological development of Marxism, and we'll spend some time talking about Marx's theory of human alienation. This is a particularly important point. In fact, there are certain Marxist thinkers today who have virtually discarded the other parts of Marxist theory. They've recognized that things like the economic theories, the theory of value, even dialectical materialism are not valid. And yet they will hold on to the theory of alienation, saying that this was really the genius of Marx, the young Marx, that this is really where the truth of Marxism lies. So we will deal with this trump card of Marxist thought. We'll also look at communism as it's applied today, and we'll see how it has become, indeed, a tremendous social failure. And finally, we'll go back, particularly in the second half of this lecture, and we'll look at the fundamental errors in Marxist thought from the point of view of, from the perspective of CAUSA, which we call the CAUSA worldview. So let's begin then by considering the influences on Marxist thought. Of course, no thinker works and lives in a vacuum. Everyone experiences a political, social, and economic environment around them. Furthermore, every philosopher is the heir to a certain philosophical tradition. And everyone has a personal life and events which occur in their own personal life which affect their thought. The era of Marx, then, has been called the Age of Revolution. The French Revolution at the close of the 19th century, close of the 18th century, introduced into Europe the revolutionary liberal ideas. And the Napoleonic wars carried those ideas throughout all of Europe. Nevertheless, the Council of Vienna in 1814, following the defeat of Napoleon, represented an attempt by reactionary forces to actually suppress this new rise of liberalism. So we see that the time of Marx was characterized by a tremendous tension between the rising liberal thought and the efforts of certain monarchic leaders to turn the clock back and go back to the pre-revolutionary situation. Furthermore, it was not only a time of political revolution, it was a time of industrial revolution. The introduction of machinery, the development of steam power and so forth, beginning in England, spreading into Belgium, moving eastward through all of Europe, brought with it, in general, the betterment of the human situation. People had more products, more diverse products, which they could choose from, which they were able to purchase than ever before. However, we have to recognize that the Industrial Revolution also brought certain social ills. The concentration of large numbers of people in the urban areas, for example, produced social dislocation and problems which had to be dealt with and had to be solved. And those problems were not solved at the time that Marx was writing and composing his ideas. On a more personal level, we find a very interesting conflict going on right in Marx's own family. Karl Marx was the descendant of an Orthodox Jewish family. In fact, his grandfathers were rabbis going back a number of generations. And yet his father, Heinrich Marx, converted himself and the entire family to Christianity, probably when Marx was very young. This was probably so that it would facilitate his pursuit of his legal career in the Prussian society. It's interesting that his mother opposed that conversion, and after the death of his father, she even went back to Judaism, returned to Judaism. So we might imagine the kind of confusion and disorientation that this would set up in the mind of the young Karl Marx. On one hand, experiencing the discrimination by the Prussian society for being part of the Jewish tradition. On the other hand, experiencing the reaction of the Jewish community towards his family, which would literally be apostate to the Jewish faith. Finally, we point out that Marx himself personally tasted the sort of reactionary suppression of liberal movements in the Prussia of his time. His high school, for example, was under constant government surveillance. It was thought to be a place where radical or liberal students or teachers were active. And furthermore, the man that Marx described as his most intimate friend of that period, Adolf Rutenberg, was confined to prison for his radical activities. So we might then begin to understand some of the influences on Marx's own life. We might consider that Marx was a person who saw a great deal of suffering in the world around him and saw a lot of suffering in his own soul, in his own mind as well. And perhaps he embarked on an attempt to understand that suffering and to solve it. And in this kind of philosophical quest in Prussia in the 19th century, he came under the tremendous influence of the German philosopher Georg Hegel, whose philosophy was reigning in Germany in academic circles at that time. Hegel is known as the philosopher of absolute idealism. And Hegel was asking the fundamental questions which philosophers ask regarding the origin of the universe and the origin of human life and where history is heading to. And he developed a tremendous scheme involving all of the universe and man and history, and this was, of course, fit into his absolutely idealistic framework. In the Hegelian scheme, God is not recognized as the God of religion. God becomes the God of philosophy. Hegel considered God to be the absolute spirit, or absoluter Geist. But we might be able to understand his concept of God if we think of it as some sort of great intellect, that the Creator is actually a great intellect, and that the process of creation, which extends into the process of human history, is the process of this great intellect, God, coming to know itself. Through creation and history, God comes to know himself. This gives history a certain goal, because the logical endpoint of this process would be when God is able to know himself completely through his creation. In other words, according to Hegel, history is moving toward the time when human beings will become absolutely rational and absolutely free. And then the absolute spirit will know itself through human beings. We might also point out that Hegel developed the concept of the dialectic of ideas. In other words, the idea that in the realm of ideas, in the realm of thought, progress occurs because there's contradiction and disagreement. In other words, there's a sort of a larger sphere of unity, but within that larger sphere of unity, disagreement brings about progress. So we will see how Marx uses the dialectic, removes it from the Hegelian framework, which is the framework of thought, and applies it to his materialism. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. For now, then, we must spend a moment to consider Hegel's theory of history, which may be called the theory of the development of freedom. For Hegel, history is like a linear process. It's moving without interruption towards the goal of rational and free people. Furthermore, it's guided along by God. Everything is under the direction and being implemented by God. So there are various stages in history where greater and greater freedom and reason are realized. For example, in the primitive society, perhaps only the slave master had a little taste of what real freedom was. Later on, it was the king who in the monarchy experienced some sort of intimation of freedom. But Hegel said that through the modern state, such as Prussia, and he defended the Prussian bureaucracy, and through the laws of the state, all citizens would come to experience genuine freedom. All citizens would experience the resolution of the conflict between individual interests and the interest of the whole. It would all be solved through the Prussian bureaucracy. So Hegel actually came to be a great defender of the status quo, a great defender of the Prussian bureaucracy as it was. Marx ultimately denounced Hegel and said that he had sold out, to become the official state philosopher. And yet, fundamentally, Marxist philosophy is coming out of Hegel, coming out of Hegelian philosophy. There's a tremendous influence of Hegel in Marx. And we can point to those 2 points. One, the development through contradiction, that is, the dialectic, which in Hegel was the dialectic of ideas. And 2, this belief, we might say, this belief that history is moving towards a definite goal and that will be the realization of complete freedom and rationality. We find this as being important characteristics of Marxist philosophy. Now, there came to be a division among the Hegelians after the death of Hegel. And this division can be understood as 2 interpretations of this key phrase found in Hegel's text, The Philosophy of Law, sometimes called the Philosophy of Right. Hegel wrote, "What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational." Well, here we can see the importance of reason and intellect and philosophy to Hegel. But in particular, we find a split between those who put more emphasis on the latter half of this phrase, that what is actual is rational. They felt that if something occurs in history, there's a reason for it. God has a reason for it, we might say. And for them, the Prussian government is actual, it's part of history, therefore it needs to be defended. This was the more conservative or right Hegelian group who defended the status quo. Whereas there was another branch of Hegelians who said that Hegel himself wasn't aware of the revolutionary implications of his own ideas. They put more emphasis on the first part, that what is rational is actual. In other words, if something doesn't conform to reason, then in a sense it doesn't really exist, and it should be done away with and it should be changed. And for them, the Prussian government fell into that category. Therefore, it had to be reformed. These were the left Hegelians, or the more radical Hegelians. There was one group which was called the Young Hegelian movement, and Marx became associated with that movement. And they were radical in their thinking. In fact, one of the lecturers of that movement, Bruno Bauer, was teaching his students that history had come to a very, very dramatic point of change that could only be compared to the time when Christianity began. In other words, the time of the coming of Christ. That sort of apocalyptic moment of history had been realized. The left Hegelians then moved more and more towards a position of defiance and rebellion against all forms of authority. And indeed, we find this attitude very clearly emerging in the works of Marx. In the introduction to his doctoral thesis, which he submitted to the University of Jena, Marx honored Prometheus as, quote, the most eminent saint and martyr in the philosophical calendar. In other words, Prometheus was the greatest hero for Marx. Of course, Prometheus is the figure in ancient mythology who stole fire from the gods and gave it to human beings. And yet he was punished for that act. The unjust gods punished Prometheus for that act of generosity. He was chained to a rock, and every day Zeus would send an eagle to consume his liver. Then the liver would grow back during the night, and again the eagle would come to torment him. Furthermore, Zeus sent his messenger to Prometheus to demand that he repent so that the punishment could end. And Prometheus stands up in a defiant rebellion against the gods and says, I would rather be chained to the rock than to become the servant of an unjust God. So for Marx, this is the very embodiment of a philosopher. A philosopher, in Marxist view, is in a state of continual rebellion against the injustice of the gods. And this is what he wrote in the introduction to his doctoral thesis. He even quoted the words of Prometheus, I hate all gods. We see Marx is moving in the direction of the anti-religious atheistic view. Of course, in 1843 he would write, religion is the opiate of the people. It was this Marx who, after completing his doctoral studies, went to work for the newly founded radical newspaper Rheinische Zeitung. And he involved the newspaper in various social and political issues of the day. He crusaded, for example, on behalf of the peasants who were prohibited by law from gathering firewood in the forest. And when he came out in support of them, he was accused by the other papers of various things, including being a communist. And at that point, he said he couldn't even comment on whether he was a communist or not because he wasn't familiar with those particular French socialist theories. It's interesting. The word communism is not born with Karl Marx, but precedes him. And at this time, he wasn't even familiar enough with communist movements to identify his position. In any event, Marx became more and more radical, and the Prussian government took additional steps to suppress him and to suppress the newspaper, which he eventually became the editor of. Finally, the newspaper was shut down. But in one of the final issues, we find this very interesting cartoon. Here Marx has depicted himself as a Prometheus of the 19th century, chained to his own printing press, while the eagle of the Prussian monarchy comes and consumes his liver. So he depicted himself as his own most eminent saint and martyr in one of the final editions of his newspaper. At this time, Marx was very concerned with making a critique of Hegel. He felt that Hegel's influence was strong among the minds of the European intellectuals, and he wanted to challenge that influence. According to Hegel, it is God who will guide men to freedom. History is unfolding according to the plan of God. However, for Marx, there is no God. So he sought to discredit the Hegelian position in the very fundamental level. In other words, Marx wanted to discredit religion itself. And it was at this time that he became familiar with the writings of another eminent German philosopher, Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach represents part of a certain current in philosophy, a certain trend in philosophy, which came to challenge very strongly the position of religion and the position of belief in God. Feuerbach wrote The Essence of Christianity in 1841, in which he said that the historical actuality, the historical reality of Jesus is very questionable, that he said instead that the various stories about Jesus were just myths and legends that were created by people living after that time. Furthermore, he said that it was not God who created man, but rather it was man who created God. He said that human beings have various desires, that they would like to be all-powerful, they would like to be all-knowing, they would like to be totally good, and that they have created an imaginary being which embodies all of these desires, all of the things that they would like to be, and this is God. Feuerbach went on to say, the divine being is nothing else than the human being. The human being has projected his own nature into an imaginary God. In fact, Feuerbach felt that man had given away or lost the best qualities of himself and given them to this imaginary being, which he calls God. Marx took from Feuerbach the most essential elements for his critique against Hegel. Feuerbach said that Hegel was confused about the relative position of subject and object. For Hegel, the thought or the idea is subject, and the material, the being, is something that follows from the thought. But Feuerbach said that just the opposite is true, that thought is something that comes out of matter, that matter is what is fundamental. And this was exciting to Marx. This position, this materialism of Feuerbach, Marx would incorporate in and would use to modify the philosophy of Hegel and ultimately to come up with the Marxist materialism. It's interesting to point out that what we see in Hegel is classically the position of atheism, the position of materialism. However, Feuerbach didn't like those terms. He didn't really want to be called an atheist or a materialist, but rather he preferred the term humanist. Of course, we find that same trend in Marxism today, that they will tend to shun the terms atheist or materialist, such as the Sandinistas of Nicaragua, and would rather refer to themselves as humanists and allege that they can embrace various religious doctrines. However, the root and basis of Marxism is an atheistic, materialistic position, which says that matter is the essence of all things. Now that we've sort of seen the building blocks or the components of Marxist ideology, let's look at how Marx assembled his thoughts and chronologically how Marxism developed. In August of 1843, a key year in the development of Marx's ideas, he wrote a manuscript which has come to be known as a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law, in which he challenged Hegel's position that the state is going to be an instrument to guide human beings to freedom. Marx said the fundamental problem, which is a conflict between the individual desires and the benefit of the whole, will not be overcome by the state. That if anything, the state is just going to be an obstacle, preventing people from solving their problems. In October of 1843, in a text called On the Jewish Question, he carried this position one step further. He said that the individual must restore what Marx calls the original species essence. He said that man is a species being, a special kind of being, and that it's essential for human beings to restore what he called their species essence. Well, this is a very interesting idea, and we're going to pursue this concept of species essence a little bit, and it's going to lead us into the concept of alienation. What is the meaning, what is the idea of species essence involved? It involves essential qualities of human being. In other words, the qualities that set a human being apart from other species. Well, this is an important concept in the religious tradition. Religionists and believers speak of the original human nature, the nature that is endowed into human beings by the Creator. They understand that there's something very special about a human being, humanness or humanity, and that it comes from God. Now, the Marxist position is that that doesn't come from God because there is no God. So therefore, Marx must come up with some alternative explanation for where the human essence comes from, how the human essence comes into being. Furthermore, Marxism is based on the idea that the human essence has been lost, that there's an original human nature or species essence, but that man has become estranged. He has become separated from his real humanness, his real humanity. In other words, alienation has occurred. This is not a new idea. In fact, this is a fundamental concept in the religious view. We find this at the very core of Judaism and at the very core of Christianity. The idea that a fall of man has occurred, that the original nature is not really being expressed, that human beings have original sin or are somehow not really manifesting their total potential. And this is attributed to a spiritual separation from God. Now, the Marxist view deals with the same idea, that the human being that we see today is not the true human being, but it does so from a different point of view. It talks about alienation. And in particular, this alienation is a material process. The species essence of man has been lost in some kind of material way. Nothing to do with God, nothing to do with spiritual things, but some sort of economic phenomenon has occurred, and man has lost his species essence. Therefore, the solution is an economic solution, and it can be realized through political upheaval. This solution was not fully described until several years later, when Marx and Engels wrote the German ideology. And yet, in 1843, Marx had developed the essential features of this view. So let's look at the Marxist idea of alienation, where it comes from, and how it can be solved. We won't be able to understand the Marxist view of alienation, however, unless we talk a little bit about the view of Jean Lamarck as to how evolution occurs, how a species becomes a new species. Actually, Lamarckism, or Lamarck's theory of the mutation of species, is at the very basis of the Marxist concept of what is a human being. So what is Lamarckism? Some people say that it shouldn't be called Lamarckism, that actually it's a concept that goes back prior to Lamarck, and that he shouldn't be saddled with the responsibility for this theory. But in any case, it has come to be known as Lamarckism. It has to do with the inheritance of acquired characteristics. It says that the species evolved through the inheritance and transmission of acquired characteristics. So it postulates 3 steps that allow a species to be converted or to be mutated into a new species. The first is interaction with the environment. This produces a series of physiological changes, and these in turn are passed on to the offspring. So, for example, how does a new species of lemur come about? This animal is a lemur, by the way. So how does a lemur become transformed and mutated into some new kind of lemur? Well, this animal crawls around in the trees in search of its food. So as it's crawling in the trees, that's its interaction with the environment. And that interaction with the environment is producing physiological changes. So its muscles are getting stronger. Its fingers are getting longer. The nervous system is developing. The eyesight is getting keener. And eventually, when it has offspring, those offspring are going to be new species of lemurs. Well, Marxism applies this same Lamarckian view to the origin of human beings. In other words, for Marx, the human being is just another animal that has to go out around in the trees in search of its food. And this is where the human essence comes from. In the communist theory of alienation, this human essence comes from a process, the process whereby the ape-like ancestor becomes transformed into a human being. That it is this process itself which gives rise to the human species essence. In other words, the thing that is most important in terms of the man's humanity, the humanity of men and women, the most important factor is the interaction with the environment. And this is what Marx means when he talks about labor. Labor is the human interaction with the environment. And in particular, if we look at Engels' text called The Importance of Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, we find an explanation, apparently accepted by Marx, as to how the ape-like being became transformed into the human being. He talks about how these beings began to use tools. And when they used tools, this involved the development of the hand and the opposed thumb and this sort of thing. Furthermore, this use of tools and this specialization of labor necessitated the development of language. And language, in turn, affected the nervous system. And the capacity for reason developed. So it was these factors which allowed the ape to become the human being. And here we see the central importance of labor in Marxism. Actually, Engels went so far as to say, it is labor which has created human beings. So labor takes the position of God. Once we understand that, we can begin to understand the Marxist view of alienation. After all, if labor is so important, if labor is really what makes one a human being, then the problem of alienation must have to do with the problem of labor. And that's exactly what Marx eventually came to write in his economic and philosophical manuscripts. So in those manuscripts, he talks about the different types of alienation. For example, the first type of alienation which he mentions is the alienation of the laborer from the product of his labor. He says that the laborer needs to have a very close and intimate relationship with the things that he produces. And yet, the specific economic system of capitalism has destroyed that relationship. Because the capitalist, through the private property laws and the private property relationships, seizes the product of the worker's labor. And therefore, the worker is estranged or separated from what he produces. Therefore, it is the private property relationship which produces this type of alienation. Marx goes on to talk about the alienation of the laborer from his labor itself. And again, we see that it's related to the concept of private property. The laborer is supposed to enjoy an intimate relationship with his laboring activity. That activity is the expression of his humanity. And yet, according to Marx, that relationship is broken apart under capitalism. Because the capitalist has already seized the product of labor, then the only thing that the worker has to offer as a commodity on the market is his labor itself. So he sells that to the capitalist. It's like selling his soul. It's like selling the best part of himself. Again, private property brings this about. Then Marx spoke about the alienation of the human species, which essentially results from the two components that we just spoke about. In other words, the worker is separated from his labor, he's separated from the product of his labor, therefore he's deprived of his species essence. He's not really a human being. And finally, Marx talks about the alienation of man from man, that there's really no possibility for human relationships because there's no humanity. There's no joy in life. There can be no interhuman relationships. Well, it's a very bleak and dismal picture. And according to Marx, the culprit, the reason why all this occurs is private property itself. It is the private ownership of property that has caused man to lose his species essence, his very humanness. This is the problem. And Marx would later write, in this sense, communists can condense their theory in the single sentence, abolition of private property. Now, for those who may have a philosophical inclination, I should mention that it is sometimes said that the problem is not private property per se, the problem is division of labor. And in fact, we find in Marx's writings the idea that division of labor came first, this brought about alienation, and then alienation itself produced private property. However, that may be the case. But we also find that for Marx, division of labor and private property are really the same thing. They're just different expressions of the very same thing. He writes in the German Ideology, division of labor and private property are, moreover, identical expressions. So, by the end of 1843, through some kind of reasoning process, as we have just described, Marx arrives at his solution to the human problem. In this text, Introduction to a Contribution of Hegel's Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law, he says the solution is the negation of private property by the proletariat. At this point, it's important to mention that there is some kind of feeling that Marxism is a scientific discipline, that Marxism involves application of the scientific method. So it's worth our while to recall just what the scientific method is all about. The scientific method does not deny the idea of intuition or the idea of a feeling. In fact, it talks about generating hypotheses, ideas, possible concepts. And then it involves experiment in order to verify whether or not those hypotheses are correct. The slide has the word proof. Perhaps proof is too strong a word. But in any case, the scientific method involves the verification or the unverification of hypotheses. The scientific method is characterized by objectivity and open-mindedness. If someone begins with a hypothesis and then is unwilling to admit that that hypothesis might be incorrect, the scientific method breaks down. It doesn't work. The good scientist has to always be ready to revise his assumptions if they don't match up with reality. And this is precisely what Marxism lacks. Marxism is characterized by an unscientific or ascientific attitude. Marx became fixed on this concept of negation of private property as early as 1843. This was before, and of course, that would be done through the overthrow of capitalism and involve the class struggle by the proletariat. But it's interesting to note that this conclusion is coming long before Marx went to England and began his celebrated study of economics, long before he wrote Das Kapital, long before he investigated the capitalist system. He basically had already arrived at his program. What had to be done was the negation of private property. This would bring the solution to human alienation. And yet we might ask a few simple questions. How could he know, how could he justify the idea that the proletariat was going to be the instrument of liberation? How did he even know that there was some kind of inherent and fundamental contradiction in capitalism? Actually, this idea is an idea straight out of Hegel, that everything has within it its own contradiction. He is rather looking at things from a Hegelian point of view and accepting it on faith that there must be some kind of contradiction in capitalism. No way of knowing that. And furthermore, how did he know that this kind of wholesale destruction of people and of a certain economic system would recover man's true species essence? Of course, he didn't know. He didn't know, even though he may have pretended that he knew. There's really no verification by logic or science or examination of history that these things were correct. Therefore, Marx's method is rather different from the scientific method. The method of Marx and Marxists is somewhat different. First of all, Marx came up with his conclusion, and then he wrote volumes and volumes of philosophical justification for that conclusion. But actually, there's never really any verification of his fundamental assumptions. If we study the personal life of Marx, we find that his attitude was subjective. He wanted to silence those who opposed him, and he was not open to revising his starting assumptions. What he generates is actually not a scientific theory at all. It's a doctrine, and we will show that it is a false doctrine at that, and that Marx was not scientific. Well, if he wasn't scientific, if he wasn't getting his conclusions from scientific analysis, then where were his conclusions coming from? In the main, they are emotional conclusions. And that is also a characteristic of Marxism-Leninism throughout its history, that it is actually an emotional response to a situation. It amplifies resentment. It amplifies human anger, resentment, and discontent. It is very much an emotional sort of movement. Marx himself had already come to his conclusions before he ever went and began his celebrated studies of economics and of economic theory. So he actually went to Paris, we might say, in order to gather the justification and to put together the justification for what he'd already concluded. Marx was in Paris from November 1843 to February 1845 and produced a study of economic theory known as the Economic or Philosophical Manuscripts, sometimes called the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. It doesn't seem to be too important. Either title is good. These are also known as the Paris manuscripts. It's actually in these manuscripts that the whole theory of alienation is expounded. But what is Marx really saying in here? He says the worker has become a commodity. He says capitalists are exploiting the workers. He says the worker becomes poorer the more wealth he produces. Well, these are the positions of the various socialists of that time, whom Marx called utopian socialists. Actually, there's nothing really new or distinctively Marxist coming out of these positions. Marxist materialism did not take on its most distinctive features until 1845, when Marx broke from the orthodox materialism and wrote his Theses on Feuerbach, where he broke completely from the humanism of Feuerbach. This, of course, is where Marx said that philosophers had been talking about the world. The point was to change it. And here, Marx came to critique very strongly the position of Feuerbach. And Marx attempted to develop a really perfect materialism, what we could call a rigorous materialism. In fact, he felt that there was a contradiction or an inconsistency within Feuerbach. According to Feuerbach, man has lost his species essence to an imaginary God. Man has given away the best part of himself to God, and that is the fundamental problem. So, the solution is, remove God from religion. Create humanistic religion. Create religion centered upon man. This is the solution. However, Marx took an even more extreme position that it's important for us to understand. According to Marx, religion is not the problem, although he was very anti-religious. Religion, belief in God, is simply a result of human economic alienation. The fundamental problem is the economic material problem. This is the argument that has compelled and excited and inspired many, many people. That things like religion, this is Marx's position. Of course religion is false, would be the Marxist view, but that's only a symptom of the economic problem. Therefore, Marx did not directly attack religion. He did not advocate this kind of religious activity. He said, the time for the critique of heaven has passed. Let's move from the critique of heaven, which is complete, and let's do the critique of the earth. So he advocated a material solution. Solve the economic alienation through a material way. And that, of course, came to be expounded completely when Marx was in Brussels and together with Engels wrote The German Ideology, in which he lays the foundation for what we know today as dialectical and historical materialism, and in which he calls for violent revolution as the solution to the human problem. It's necessary, of course, to enter into the labyrinth of Marxist literature in order to understand how each step of this argument is carried out. However, these are the essential conclusions that he was arriving at. Later on, during that time period, he wrote The Poverty of Philosophy, attacking the French thinker Proudhon for his ideas that reform could come peacefully. Proudhon wrote The Philosophy of Poverty and called for peaceful solutions. And Marx said, impossible. The solution must be through violence. In the summer of 1847, Marx and Engels had been able to move to certain positions of power and authority in Brussels, and they went into England, into London, and joined what was known as the League of the Just. The League of the Just became known as the League of Communists, and the League of Communists requested Marx and Engels to draw up a statement of position. What is the position of the communist movement with respect to the various social and political questions of the day? And of course, in February 1848, Marx and Engels produced the celebrated Communist Manifesto. In a sense, this is the declaration of communist revolution and the birth of communism as we know it today. Communism is a program that offers a certain promise. It promises to resolve the fundamental human problem, which Marx considers to be alienation. This will be done through the negation of private property by a certain select group called the proletariat, through violent revolution. So communism is a position and a program committed to revolution. Revolution is indispensable. And Marx became a man dedicated to bringing about revolution. Well, how did he do it? Actually, he wasn't a military man. He wasn't a person who actually took up arms and went to the street himself. But rather, he wanted to see the proletariat take up arms. He wanted to see the workers move out into the streets and destroy the system. Therefore, he dedicated himself to motivating the workers. And in order to do this, Marx came to the conclusion that more important than the material weapons was the philosophical weapon. Well, it's almost a paradoxical position for a materialist to take. And yet, Marx wrote as follows: as philosophy finds its material weapons in the proletariat, so the proletariat finds its spiritual weapons in philosophy. The head of the emancipation is philosophy, its heart is the proletariat. For Marx, everything is a weapon. The proletariat, the human beings themselves are weapons. The thoughts that they have in their minds are weapons. The proletariat is the material aspect, and the very ideas which they're thinking are the spiritual aspect, and it's all designed to bring about the revolution. The proletariat is the heart of the revolution, and the philosophy is the head. Well then, Marxism, Marxist ideology, is indeed a philosophical weapon. And let's spend a moment to consider the three fundamental components of this philosophical weapon. And we're going to take some time after lunch to examine these three components in a little bit of detail. For now, though, we can consider that one component is the economic theories, Das Kapital, and the other economic writings. From the point of view of a philosophical weapon, which is Marx's own point of view, what's the purpose of these economic theories? What is he trying to prove in Das Kapital? Essentially, he wants to prove that capitalism is a system which requires exploitation. That exploitation is not something that a few misguided individuals do. Not at all. Capitalism cannot function without exploitation. This is the Marxist position. If that's the case, then the solution cannot just be the changing around of a few minds and hearts of a few misguided capitalists, but rather the system must be destroyed and the capitalists themselves must be destroyed. This is the point, the thrust of the economic theories. The second component is what's known as dialectical materialism, the metaphysics of Marxism. What is Marx trying to accomplish through his metaphysical arguments? Essentially, he wants to destroy the very ethics of Christianity, the very ethics of the religious tradition. The religious tradition teaches, in general, love. Particularly Christianity teaches love your enemy. Well, obviously, this is a big barrier to making the revolution. Marxism wants to teach destroy your enemy. So the materialism itself argues that there is no God. And if there's no God, then there's no laws of God and commandments of God. We have to come up with our own ethics and our own morality. And the dialectic aspect says, yes, we can find ethics in the universe. If we look in the universe around us, we see that progress comes through conflict. Therefore, we're going to make social progress and political progress only through conflict, only through the destruction of our enemies. And ultimately, this translates into a tremendous justification for murdering one's enemies, the opposite of the commandments of God. Finally, the third component is historical materialism, or the materialist view of history. This is dialectical materialism applied to history. And this is an essential part of Marxism. In fact, this is probably one of the most stimulating parts of Marxism to people who are exposed to it. It is historical materialism which gives an apocalyptic feeling to Marxist ideology. Now is the time. This is a special moment in history. It's like the final days, the last days of history. For the Marxist, all we need to do is take a few more steps and we'll be in the workers' paradise. All we have to do is destroy the capitalist system. It's the final barrier, and we'll have this paradise on earth. Furthermore, historical materialism argues that communism is the historical inevitability. You can destroy yourself fighting against communism, but you can't stop communism. Communism is inevitable, inevitable for China, inevitable for Latin America. Actually, we see that this kind of thinking has very much seeped into American thought today. The idea that, well, communism is an inevitable part of the future for Central America, for example, is an idea that many, many intellectuals have. This is the whole point of historical materialism. You might as well jump on the bandwagon because this is where history is going. With these three components, Marxism attempts to arm the proletariat with a philosophy and to bring about revolution. And we have to understand that as a philosophical weapon, Marxism has been very successful. In fact, there have been a whole series of revolutions. The first successful one was the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So since 1917, we've been living in a great experiment, we might say, a communist experiment. And in the second part of this lecture, after lunch, we're going to look at the results of that experiment. We'll ask the question, have slightly more than 66 years of communist effort brought about the promised results? Has alienation been solved? Has the human problem been resolved? Well, to anticipate our conclusion, no, it hasn't. And we will close this session with the words of the French writer André Gide. Gide was an enthusiast when he first heard about Marxism, and prior to his first visit to the Soviet Union in 1937, he wrote these words: "My conversion is like a faith. All my being goes toward a single goal. In the deplorable state of anxiety of the modern world, the plan of the Soviet Union seems to me to constitute the salvation of mankind." That was before he ever set foot in the Soviet Union. Later, after his visit, he wrote a devastating critique of what was happening in the Soviet Union. Gide was totally disillusioned, and this is just one excerpt from that critique. "The disappearance of capitalism in Soviet Russia has not brought freedom of the Soviet worker. Those who parade themselves so proudly are those whose prosperity has been bought at the price of infinite poverty." So in the second part of this lecture, we're going to have a look at that system which has been established in Soviet Russia. We're going to challenge the idea that capitalism ever disappeared there, and we're going to see some examples of the misery and poverty that communism has brought. We'll talk about communism as a social failure, and we'll go back and see the very errors inside of Marx's reasoning that assured his program of failure rather than success, the fundamental errors of Marxism.
I hope that you enjoyed this presentation as much as I did. I think that you'll agree that Mr. Billet possesses tremendous clarity on this topic. By now, we have come to understand some of the fundamental tenets of Marx's theory. In the second portion of this lecture, Bill will present to us a critique on those tenets, as well as give to us a basic introduction to the CAUSA worldview. Please join us.